Hey guys, I just want to go through some things really quick with you all. This video will focus on the biggest failure of the progressive movement, and that is the inequality for African Americans during this time. Um, because obviously, Plessy versus Ferguson comes out in the 1890s, the whole separate but equal doctrine, all of that. I'm going to go give you guys some specifics of how the progressive era did not really usher in a new age of equality for African Americans. I mean, and you're not going to see this during the New Deal either in the 30s. It's pretty much going to be till the 50s or 60s till we really see the civil rights movement start to take off. So we're going to go through a few things, and then I have annotated a key, okay, of the Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois readings, okay? So I will go through that with you guys, and that way, if you had a question about that, then we could talk about it, or well, I'll go through it, and you can get that information. So just to review, okay, Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896, and this picture pretty much sums it all up, okay? Um, because the Supreme Court basically said that segregation was okay as long as the facilities were separate but equal. Okay, but what ended up happening was the facilities were definitely separate, but they were not equal. I mean, here, this kind of illustrates it with the water fountains, the drinking fountains, but it was also schools, and everything else, especially the schools. Okay, African American schools received about 10 times less funding than most white schools. So those are some staggering numbers, but this is important to know. Okay. Now, so there were some problems in the South. Okay. Big shocker, right? And problems in the South were in the post Reconstruction era, because remember, there were federal troops in the South after the Civil War to kind of, at least try to keep everything in order, quell the unrest. But after the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes became president, the deal was that the North would take the troops out of the South. And that's what Hayes did. As president, he removed the federal troops from the South. And then this opened up the door to all kinds of violence, lynchings, all of those things. There was actually one case that happened in 1908 in Fulton County, which, if you don't know where that's at, that's pretty close to here. It's about an hour on the other side of Murray. And there was a case, let me move my head over. There was a case with David Walker. Okay, he was an African American man living in a farmhouse in Fulton County, and a bunch of night riders, this group of people that was really involved in tobacco patch wars, a bunch of white men, about 50 of them, went to this guy's house because apparently he had said, it doesn't matter what he had done, but what they did to him was obviously inexcusable. But apparently he had said a word to a white woman, like a slur word. And so they went to his house and they set fire to his house, his farmhouse. And as he was throwing out, as he was trying to get out of the house, he says he threw open the door pleading for mercy. They shot him to death. And then his wife was also in the house at the time, and she tried to run out with their kids, and they gunned every single person down. So David Walker, his wife, and his kids. The governor of Kentucky, interestingly enough, actually offered a reward. So that was a positive thing on our part. Other states probably would not have done that. Our governor did offer a reward to catch the perpetrators of this, but nobody was ever convicted in this case. And this was not a one-time rodeo, because in the South, whites used violence to force politics and the policies that they wanted. If you recall, we talked about it, the Wilmington insurrection, where you had the um, white Democrats try to overthrow the Republican government in Wilmington, North Carolina, that had some white Republicans, but it also had several black officials, and they succeeded in effectively overthrowing the government by using violence to keep voters at home. And the other thing is, in the South, and this is going to be a problem until the 1960s. This is the whole reason why Martin Luther King and John Lewis in 1965 marched to Selma, Alabama from Montgomery. It's that blacks could not vote, okay, and that's problematic enough as it is, because it's a democracy, everybody should have the right to vote. But you have to, in order to serve on a jury, you have to be registered to vote. That's the key. And so what they were seeing in the South during this time is you had all white juries, and that was bad for one of two reasons. One, let's say there's a case where a black man is on trial and it's very circumstantial evidence. Most of the time, the white jury is going to return a guilty verdict. And we kind of talked about that after the Civil War with like the convict leasing system. There were just some bullcrap charges in some cases to force African Americans into this system. But two, let's say a white person is on trial for, like the murder of a black person. A lot of times they would get off scot free because the jury was all white in the South. So we definitely have some things going on in the South. We covered that a couple weeks ago. That this is to be expected. Okay. However, we also had problems in the North. In New York City, you would think, oh, the North was loyal to the Union, so African Americans are probably treated great there. Not really the case. There were also some problems in the North. North had segregation. In New York City, for instance, blacks could not be doctors or public school teachers. And Teddy Roosevelt, who was from New York, was somewhat kind of racist. Okay, and an example of that is in 1901, whenever Teddy Roosevelt had been president, he invited Booker T. Washington up to the White House for dinner. Well, as soon as this happens, the whole nation, especially the South, is in an uproar. The audacity of Roosevelt to invite a black man to the White House. And this is covered by all the newspapers. All the newspapers go in an outcry. Newspaper Memphis, Tennessee, says something along the lines of like Roosevelt has committed like treason against the country with this treacherous act or something like that, some hyperbolic language. But after this, he never once invited an African American leader to the White House, and he even admitted to his friend later that he thought blacks were inferior to whites, that he thought whites were above blacks. And he professed a admiration for Robert E. Lee, going on a tour of the South a few years after this incident. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt never went out of his way to help African Americans, but also his distant cousin, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, that we're going to talk about when we get to the Depression and World War II, he really did not make an effort either. Okay, but again, not calling those two guys out. To be fair, really, we didn't see anybody really start to, I would say, after World War II, Truman integrated. It was like baby steps. Truman integrated the military. Eisenhower called in the National Guard to help in Little Rock. John F. Kennedy started to get the ball rolling, but it just was one of those things that took time and years. All right, Brownsville, Texas. So this is an example of how Roosevelt was very unsympathetic to blacks and their cause. In Brownsville, Texas, there was let's just call it a bar fight for what it is between blacks and whites. It was an African American regiment that had been highly decorated veterans of the Spanish American War. They get into a little scuffle down in Texas. To this day, nobody knows who fired the first shot. We just know, there was a scuffle. What ends up happening, the bartender is killed and one white policeman is wounded. Now, this is an entire regiment, okay? There's probably only a couple people involved. You guys are smart enough, you know how these things work. Roosevelt dishonorably discharged the entire regiment of soldiers, 167 of them, and he removed every single one of them from the military after this event. Now, this event actually is met with a lot of criticism from people across the nation, because even people who may be ambiguous about racism and African American rights, whatever, they recognize this just isn't logical. This isn't right, because a lot of these people, these soldiers, these African American soldiers who were discharged, they had Congressional Medal of Honor from their time in the Spanish American War in 1898, but that didn't matter. And Roosevelt kicked all of them out of the military. So wait a second. Sorry, that's going to happen a time or two. Stupid auto lights. Okay. But this alone showed that Roosevelt in race, he was not really an advocate for African American rights. Now we're going to talk about some major African American figures in the late 1800s. Okay, real quick. So I'm thinking on your quiz, as the time I'm filming this, I have not written the questions out, but I'm definitely going to ask you something along the lines of this video. So, I'll probably ask you about like what was the big failure of the progressive movement? What were some responses to the negative, that was going around with toward African Americans, how progressives did not address it. Like, what did some of these major African American figures try to do to combat this racism and prejudice and segregation and all that? Ida B. Wells, all right, very, very, very important lady. She was actually, I know Plessy versus Ferguson was like in the 1890s, but even in the 1880s, she was actually the first African American to ever challenge a lawsuit over segregation. So she was one of the first. She was the first one to take it before the court. Okay. But her biggest thing is that she was one of the primary founders of the NAACP in 1909, which the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It still exists today, but she was one of the people involved in that. And she was also, as a woman, she was also highly involved in women's suffrage, which obviously is really, really significant. Next up. All right, Booker T. Washington. Those of you who read Source 1 read all about Booker T. Washington. So, Booker T. Washington was the very, very first president of the Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama. Now, those of you who had me last year will remember the Tuskegee Institute plays a major role during World War II with the Tuskegee Airmen, which was the first all African American unit in United States history. And they actually played like a big role in helping to defeat Hitler overseas in Germany. But Booker T. Washington, as president of Tuskegee Institute, he stressed that African Americans need to gain like practical knowledge, like the ability to have a more like skilled jobs, skilled labor, um, than like having like higher education and like voting and all that. He said that African Americans need to learn how to basically live and sustain themselves, make a living, have a skill that contributes to the rapidly industrializing American society. Okay. But the problem was that he emphasized this above blacks getting basic civil rights. And we're going to actually, I'm just kind of calling an audible here. I was going to go through the slides and then show the source, but I think this would work better. So you kind of have the bullet points. And now, let's see, can I get out? Yes, I can. Sorry. We're going to look at the Booker T. Washington reading some specific events, or excuse me, quotes from it and what it means. Because that way, like if you did the PSA and you weren't for sure, now you know, and you can include, some evidence in your quiz. Okay. So, Booker T. Washington, and again, I marked this up just like y'all do. Booker T. Washington is given this speech, okay, at the Atlanta Exposition, which is basically kind of like an event, like, whoop, what do you do? Look how far the South has come, okay? But he's talking about this, how there's an opportunity afforded that will awaken within a new era of industrial progress. Okay, so he's acknowledging that like the nation has really progressed. He's basically talking about industrialization here. But now he's talking about African Americans in this next section. He says, ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first few years of our new life, we began at the top instead of the bottom. That a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill. That the political convention or stump speaking had more traction than starting a dairy farm or a truck garden. Okay. Now, he's talking about like life skills and he's saying ignorant and inexperienced. So think about it. African Americans have all these rights for the first time in history. I mean, it's logical that they would want to, vote, and some of them would want to run for political office and run for Congress and all these things, especially with the Republican governments in the South led by the carpetbaggers, especially with those governments backing them. But what Washington is saying here is that like they went after these things, but when they did that, they did not get like land or a skill they could use, or they did not get, or like knowing how like to go to a political convention and do those things was more appealing to them than like having a dairy farm or a truck garden or whatever. Okay, so then he launches into this extended metaphor. Okay, so he's kind of established, he's like, we got our freedom, that was great, but we kind of, his point is kind of like we kind of skipped to the top when we had to start at the bottom and work our way up. Okay. Now this whole thing, if you're, and I'm gonna take the color off this now just so it doesn't get confusing. I'm just highlighting as we go so you guys can clearly see. This whole thing right here, okay? This is an extended metaphor, okay? Now, I don't know about y'all, but like I had to read it a couple times as well because it's like a ship lost for sea sees a friendly vessel and it's lost at sea and it's dying of thirst, so it doesn't want to drink the salt water, okay? And the ship keeps responding. The other ship keeps responding. Cast your bucket down into the water and see what happens. And obviously, the ship that's struggling is like, that doesn't make any sense. That's salt water. That ain't going to work. Okay. But whenever the ship that's in distress finally casts their bucket down, it says the captain of the distressed vessel, at least heeding the injunction, cast down his bucket and it came up full of fresh water from the mouth of the Amazon. If I could put this in modern terms, basically what Washington is saying here is that like the grass is not always greener on the other side. That you had during this time, you had because this is what he talks about here, about people moving to like foreign lands, people who want to leave the country. He's saying that like that's not always the best thing. Because the moral of this story is that the ship in distress thought that things were terrible where it was at. That's why it wasn't getting water. But whenever they just trusted the other person and let their bucket down, up came fresh water and they were fine. Okay. So again, it's an extended metaphor that's going to make sense here in just a second. Because then he says, to those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land. Wait a second. To those who say to, sorry, I'm going to clear this out again. To those of my race who depend on bettering the conditions of foreign land, who are under the importance of cultivating friendly relations with the southern white man who's their next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your bucket for who you are. Okay? Cast down your bucket where you are. So it ties back to this. Okay? So it's saying to those people who think they're better off leaving the South where they grew up, or they don't understand like communicating with whites, in some cases their former masters, and trying to develop friendly relations with them, he's saying cast down your bucket where you are. So like the moral of this story was like they thought they had it bad in being lost in sea, but whenever they finally trusted and just let the bucket down, put the cards down the table, everything was fine. And so that's what Washington is trying to say. He's saying like we need to stay where we're at. Okay, and you need to make friends. You need to try to have a working relationship with the whites in the South. Okay, now, okay, look, he says, cast it down in agriculture, mechanics, and commerce, in domestic servant, and in the professions. Okay, now he's saying that he wants people to stay and try to work things out with the whites, but he's saying basically like focus on a job, getting a job, working a job, and contributing to society. And this is kind of the point he reiterates. He's already talked about how they leaped to like political office. He says, there we go. Let's read through this. Our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the production of our hands. So what people are making and doing is how they're going to live. The resources, they depend on themselves to make the resources, make a living. And fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and brains and skill, and put brains and skill, sorry, it's Friday, into the common occupations of life. Shall prosper in proportion as we learn to draw the line between the superficial, that means fake, right? If something superficial, so between the fake, the utopian, whatever, and the substantial or the significant. Okay, the gagaws of life and the useful. Okay, so saying like the stuff that's really not important versus the useful. So he also says no race can prosper till it learns there's much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. Basically, he's saying like, listen, if we're to prosper in our newfound freedom that we've had, we need to learn basic life skills. that's kind of his thesis here. That this is his argument that it's better for them to learn basic life skills than it is to seek those high political offices or to really, really push for full social equality and political equality this time. He's like, now's not the time to worry about that. Washington's idea is that they need to work on like having jobs and doing things of that nature. And then, so he talked to his African American fellows throughout this first part, right? Now, this is where he shifts. This is where he shifts. To those of the white race who look to those of foreign birth and strange. Actually, I gotta stop trying to multitask, guys. I'm sorry. To those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth and strange tongues and habits for the prosperity of the South. Who is he talking about here? Foreign birth and strange tongue and habits. Who was coming for jobs in America? And it was the immigrants. Were I permitted, I would repeat what I would say to my own race. Cast down your bucket where you are. So think about it. The Southern economy is starting to take off here. Okay, you have the steel in Birmingham, coal mines, the textile industry, the tobacco industry, the cigar, all that stuff. Okay, he's telling people in the South, all these industrial leaders, like, cast your bucket down where you are. There's no need to bring in all these immigrants that are coming over. You have all these people that you know. Okay, and it says from cast it down among the 8 million Negroes' habits who you know, whose fidelity and love you have tested in days when it proved being treacherous meant the ruin of your fireside. Cast down your bucket among those people who have, without strikes and labor wars. Washington gives this speech in 1895. Guess what happened in 1892? Homestead strike. Guess what happened in 1894? Pullman strike. So he's like, this is kind of an attack against the northern industrialists because it's or telling the southern industrialists to learn from the northern industrialists' mistakes. It's like, look, the people you have in the South right now, the newly freed African Americans, you know them, and guess what? They won't go on strike and have these labor wars like you're dealing with in the North, with all these workers that are, a lot of them are immigrants. Okay, these people have tilled your fields, cleared your forests, built your railroads, your cities, brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth. That's talking about like coal mine and all that stuff, and help make possible this magnificent representation of the progress of the South. So he's like, listen, we've come a long way since the Civil War. We have. Our economy has come a long way, and that is because of you've trusted in us. You've trusted in the black population to do these jobs. So why outsource these jobs to immigrants? He's basically like, that doesn't make any sense. Okay. I think that is the big thing. This whole paragraph is kind of redundant, but this one right here, this is what will give Washington a lot of criticism, especially from Du Bois. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers. So think about it. Separate as the fingers. Fingers are all separate. Yet one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So he's saying they can work together for mutual progress, but they can still be separate. 1895 is when Washington gives a speech. 1896 is when the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson. The idea of separate but equal. And so this is what draws a large criticism from Du Bois, is that this quote right here is basically almost like an approval stamp for segregation from Washington. And Washington says that it's okay for this to go on, as long as African Americans are given the chance to work and to learn trades, that they'll be fine. And he's saying, like, look, it is important and right that all privileges of the laws be ours. So he does acknowledge here, this kind of his counterclaim. He's like, yeah, voting and all of that stuff is great. Washington acknowledges that. But then he also says, but it is vastly more important. Okay, I'm going to mix it up. I'm going to use a different color. Let's go with that blue. Very nice. But it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. So he's basically saying, like, these privileges are great, but we need to be in a position where we can exercise those privileges and actually use them the correct way. And because, like, and he kind of reiterates it here, where he says, come to us from the result of struggle rather than artificial forcing. So basically, kind of the idea of Rome and building a day overnight. He's saying, like, this social progress for African Americans, it's not going to happen overnight and it doesn't need to be forced. Rather, it'd be better for them before they get these privileges to be prepared to actually take full advantage of those. So, kind of his example he gives, the opportunity to earn $1 in the factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house. So he's saying, like, in order for them to exercise, go to the opera house, have these opportunities in society, they have to have living wages, working wages, and they have to have those opportunities that industrialization in the South has provided them. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois did not agree with Washington at all. Okay, this was source 2, so I'm going to tell you about him, and then we'll bounce right back to the doc. So Du Bois was the first African American to get a doctorate from Harvard. Okay, pretty significant deal. Okay, but he was very, very critical of Washington because he felt like he actually coined, and we'll look at this in source 2 here in a second. He coined what Washington said at the Atlanta Exposition as the Atlantic. I hate doing this on Fridays. He coined it the Atlanta Compromise. Okay, and basically he said that Washington just gave up the rights of blacks and voluntarily. And he said that, like, this wasn't needed, that, like, you had to have people of higher education, blacks of higher education, and that blacks have to have the right to vote in order to do the things that Washington is talking about. And ultimately, he wanted them to challenge segregation and discrimination. However, Washington's rebuttal against Du Bois was that he was not from the South. So Washington kind of said, like, hey, like, I'm being a realist here of what progress African Americans have in the South. Yours is kind of a utopian idea. But let's look at Du Bois' argument now, source 2. Okay, some of you guys had that. But source 2, if we look at it. We'll kind of skip through some of this, but look at this. He just talks about how Booker T. Washington has become a big deal in American history. And look, Mr. Washington came. So here he's talking about how the nation has shifted to industrialization. Kind of after the Civil War, we had Reconstruction. We were trying to better things for African Americans, but it says Mr. Washington came with a single definite program at the psychological moment when the nation was a little ashamed of having bestowed so much sentiment on Negroes. So all the rights, the 13th, 14th Amendments, for example, that African Americans got it after the Civil War, and was concentrating its energy on dollars. Concentrating its energy on dollars is talking about the industrialization that occurred in the United States. Now, his program of industrial education, conciliation of the South, and submission and silence to civil and political rights. So this is what he's saying. Just submission and silence of civil and political rights is the big thing he really underscores. Because program of industrial education doesn't sound that bad. But the submission or giving up and silence of your civil and political rights, this is where he's going to attack Washington. All right. We'll skip over that. So he's talking about how to get, like, Washington, he acknowledges Washington had a tough task, okay, to gain the cooperation of the white people living in the South. But it says, he does acknowledge, and yet 10 years later, it was done in the words spoken in Atlanta. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the 5 fingers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in one hand, all essential to human progress. And Du Bois was actually the one that coined this, the Atlanta Compromise. Okay. So he's saying that this basically opened the floodgates. Du Bois saying this opened the floodgates. He said the South interpreted it in different ways. The radicals received it as a complete surrender of the demand for civil and political equality. The conservatives as a generously conceived working basis for mutual understanding. So both approved it. And today, its author is certainly the most distinguished Southerner since Jefferson Davis and the one with the largest personal following. So he's basically saying, like, again, this was like a rubber stamp for segregation. In answer to this, it has been claimed that the Negro can survive only through submission. Mr. Washington distinctly asked that black people give up, at least for the present, the following three things. Okay. So he's acknowledging what Washington has asked. So first, the political power. That is referencing like the ability to vote and holding office. Okay. This is civil rights. You could say that could tie into voting. It could tie into the ability to property rights, the ability to serve on a jury, just basically the things that were supposed to be guaranteed under the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, okay, to our Constitution. But also this, he wanted to give up the higher education of Negro youth. So he wants industrial education, like these skills and stuff, and to help the South prosper. African Americans work these jobs, get the Southern economy up and running. But Du Bois points out that Washington wants to give this up, a higher education. So, like black people getting doctorates and master's degrees and things of this nature. He points out that Washington was not for this. And think about it, Du Bois, excuse me. I keep saying Du Bois. Du Bois was the first African American to ever get a PhD from Harvard. So this right here, I'm gonna make it a different color so it really sticks out. He is not gonna be on board with this notion at all. All right, because then Du Bois, sorry, I'm gonna keep mixing. Du Bois keeps messing. I keep messing it up. He then shifts into talking about how all these have happened since Washington has made this compromise. The disenfranchisement of the Negro. So the African Americans have lost the right to vote through the literacy test, the poll taxes, things of that. The legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority of the Negro. This is talking about segregation that came about after Plessy versus Ferguson. And then the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions to the higher training of the Negro. How African American schools are starting to lose money now, partially, if you want to connect 2 and 3 together, partially because of Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, the idea that segregation was okay, you had these separate schools, separate colleges, and again, it was supposed to be equal, but it was not. These movements are, to not be sure, direct results of Mr. Washington's teachings, but his propaganda has, without a shadow of doubt, helped their speedier accomplishment. So he's like, yeah, maybe it's not all Booker T. Washington's fault, but it definitely was the catalyst. It definitely sped along some of these things that were inevitable. Because think about it, Washington, president of Tuskegee Institute, very highly respected in both the North and the South at this time. And him saying, like, again, we could be as separate as the five fingers, but united as the hand if we needed to be, and basically rubber stamping segregation. That word is going to carry a lot. Okay, and look at this. It says the triple paradox of his career. Okay, because he says the question then comes. Du Bois says the question then comes that how can 9 millions of men make economic progress if they are deprived of their basic political rights, like the right to vote and things like that, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their, like, as exceptional men. A paradox means like something that like contradicts, like you want to do something but you can't do that one thing because of the other thing. Is a long way to say it. It's kind of like an example of a paradox would be. I'll give you an example. I want this pen. Okay, pretend this is a check. I want this pen. I have no cash on me. I do have this check, but I need the pen to sign the check. So it's like the things that Washington was wanting, he actually couldn't have. Like the things he was wanting for African Americans were like the things he was pushing was actually working against that. So, like in this case, he is striving nobly to make Negro artisans, businessmen, and property owners, but it is utterly impossible under modern competitive methods. Because think about it, this is the time of government regulation for working men and property owners to defend their rights and exist without the right of suffrage. Valid point. You might need to have the ability to vote on certain things or vote for people that are going to protect your property and your rights. He insists on self-respect, but at the same time counsels a silent submission to civic inferiority, such as bound to sap the manhood of any race in the long run. He advocates common ground industrial training and depreciates institutions of higher learning. But neither the Negro Common Schools nor Tuskegee himself, oh my goodness, he just called out the university where Washington is the president, could remain open if it were not for teachers trained in Negro colleges or trained other graduates. So he's saying you got to have higher learning for these places to operate, right? You have to have professors, you have to have experts, and you have to have some people go to those higher learning schools. It can't just all be everybody goes to trade school and industrial school. That's basically what he's saying. So he's saying, here's what most African Americans, Negroes, whatever, or what they want: the right to vote, civic equality, so basically the end of discrimination, and the education of youth according to ability. So this means right here, the education of youth according to ability. If somebody is super, super smart, okay, highly intelligent, highly capable of, I don't know, going to Harvard, for instance, like Du Bois did. Du Bois is saying that he wants that person to be able to do that they should not be confined to a certain role in society, um, based on this Atlanta Compromise. Okay. This here, this is Du Bois' kind of like closing argument, his counterclaim rebuttal, if you want to call it that. He's talking about African Americans. He says, listen, we do not expect the right to vote, the civic rights, and be educated will come in a moment. And we do not expect racism or bias and prejudices of years to disappear just like that. But he also says that African Americans, in this case, are absolutely certain that the way for people to gain their reasonable rights is not by just tossing them in the trash. So it's like he kind of he acknowledges that they know it's going to take a while, but he also says like, yeah, you're not going to get rights by throwing them away. Anyway, I know that was a lot, but I just want to go through it with you guys. And I'll put in the comments, hopefully I don't forget, that if you need to skip through part of this, if you understood everything, you're fine, but I just wanted to go over all that if you needed it. Just as you guys study, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys again on Thursday. Have a great rest of your day.